want to make a quick video about something that I saw about a week ago and didn't have the opportunity until now to do it. So I saw this pastor post on Twitter, and he said, "Dear Christian young men, if guys like Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, and Joe Rogan have more of an impact on your worldview than guys like the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, and the other writers of the New Testament, you should reconsider and reprioritize. Make your A-list scripture and your B-list everyone else." Now, this guy pitches himself as an evangelist, author, podcaster, and revolutionary. And his revolutionary idea seems to be to notice that these names are a lot more impactful than he is, and so he's trying to latch on to their engagement while also criticizing what they're doing, because it's not Bible. It's not good enough because it's not Bible. And what I said was, pastors treat, and what I mean is bad pastors treat young men the way that nagging mothers do. And they have this impulse to scold and correct. But this is a very feminine way of trying to change behavior. And really, it's, if anyone has ever been nagged, you'll realize it's not really very effective in motivating men. So what I wanted to share was a clip from Jordan Peterson's interview with Greg Laurie. And this was, I think, a really good moment. So I'm going to play the clips out of order. First, where Jordan talks about like why he didn't really have a lot of respect for the like evangelical Christians that he knew growing up. And I think he really nails something about what kind of guy this guy is, probably, and what kind of people this guy is capable of reaching. And it's really the people who are too scared.
So when I was a kid, you see, I was struck by a moral conundrum, and I think it has something to do with religious pretension. And so I'd be interested in your opinion on this, is that the more religious people that I grew up with, so I grew up in what was essentially a frontier town. Fairview had only been settled about 50 years before, scraped out of the prairie 50 years before. We were in the northernmost reaches of the North American prairie.
Yes.
And it was a relatively rough working class town. And most of my friends were relatively rough working class kids. And I hung around with, I wouldn't exactly call them delinquents because there were some seriously bad kids, and my friends weren't in that group, but they were, most of them dropped out of high school, in grade 10 or so, went worked on the rigs. They were tough kids. And there was the odd evangelical.
Yeah. They
weren't exactly Jesus freaks because we weren't a hippie community, really. But I was leery of them because I think there was a Nietzschean reason for that, is that, Nietzsche said that most morality is cowardice. Now, he didn't mean that morality was cowardice because he wasn't a simple-minded character, but what he meant often was that people who were afraid justified their fear by giving it a facade of the moral.
Yeah.
And what I noticed about the moral Christian teenagers that I knew is that they were timid and afraid and obedient, and they justified that by reference to their religious morality. Yeah. And I didn't like that. I liked one of my best friends, for example. He got kicked out of school when he was in grade 10 for picking a fight with the phys ed instructor. And you think, well, that's pretty bad. It's like, well, he was only 15, and this phys ed instructor could do an iron cross. He was tough, muscular, tough guy. And the fact that my friend picked a fight with him, I'm not trying to whitewash that, but it was also extremely brave. He was not a coward.
Yeah.
And it was a foolish thing to do because had it progressed to any great distance, he would have been pounded flat. but he was a tough kid.
Yeah.
And I admired that. And when I watched the more religious types, so to speak, they were too afraid to engage in life. And then I learned later, as a psychologist, there's a literature on misbehavior in adolescence. Okay, so you imagine a normal distribution of misbehavior.
Yeah.
Over here are the kids who, like, they steal and they drink and they take too many drugs and they engage in early sexual promiscuity and they don't do well. That's like pathway to life course criminality. Right. Then there's the kids over here who never break any rules. Well, they don't do well either. Yeah. They end up dependent and depressed and anxious. And then there's the kids in the middle who break enough rules when they're teenagers to explore, but basically take a straight path. They're the ones that do well. And so I saw the religious types, so to speak, fall into that timid camp that was dependent. And that turned me away from that. So I don't know if that experience rings any bells for you. Or
well, I'm over in this category here. I was the one, like my cousin, older than me, named Wayne. He is a psychologist. It was preparing to become a psychologist. And so he did a study on me as a young man. And he said, clearly, you're headed in the wrong direction.
To contrast this, I want to play the clip that actually came right before what Jordan just shared. And this is to contrast this guy Greg with is his name Greg? Yeah, his name's Greg, with the other Greg Laurie, who I think actually seems like he's doing a really good job as a pastor because he actually sees what Jordan is doing correctly.
So my mom almost looks like she kept marrying the same guy. They were kind of, you might call them barflies. They're the guys that have just a few too many of their buttons on their shirt undone. And they're hanging out in the bar. And so she kept marrying like the same guy in sense. And then she met this guy from New Jersey. He was an attorney. He was intelligent. He was educated. He was very conservative, and I don't know what my mother saw in him. He was so different, but he literally took an interest in me. He adopted me. He gave me his last name and treated me as a father should treat a son. So one day
you had a taste of that.
Yeah, so he was that one bright spot, and then there's a neat connecting story where I was able to reconnect later with him and in a sense return the favor a little bit. But so when I came out of school one day in New Jersey, where we were living at the time, the car was packed up with all of our luggage. And I said, where are we going? My mom said, we're going to Hawaii. I said, well, where's Dad? She said, he's not coming. And I didn't see him for the rest of my childhood. So we flew to Honolulu. She had already met another guy who was the most abusive of all of her husbands. In fact, this guy knocked her unconscious with a wooden statue when they were having a drunken fight. And I climbed out of the window of my bedroom and ran to the neighbors, and we moved back to California. But, so this was, I remembered him, and he was someone that was stable. He disciplined me. He gave me an allowance. One time I stole something from a store and he took me down to the jail and introduced me to the prisoners, trying to keep me away from a life of crime. Problem was, I thought it was kind of cool. I kind of missed the memo, but he was a father figure. So even though because I was not planned, my mom had a one night stand in Long Beach and I was conceived, and I found that out like 30 years later. But because he treated me as a father should treat a son, I've always thought of him and spoken of him as my dad. So here's the cool thing. Even if you're broken, if you're raised in a broken home and you don't have a biological father, I think a man can step in and be a father figure.
Yes.
It could be a pastor. It could be a coach. It could be an uncle. It could be a friend. But a man can step in and show a young man or a young one, because young women obviously need dads too. He can step in and be that father figure for them. And Oscar did that. And then later, after I became a Christian, there was a pastor named Chuck Smith who was kind of that father figure for a lot of us. So it kind of helped me and a lot of other young men find our way. And I think that needs to, and like I was saying to you earlier, I watched a film about you, and in the rise of Jordan Peterson. And I saw these young men coming up to you, and it was so interesting to me because they're very young, and they're reading what you've written, and they've found you on YouTube. One young man said, "I was extremely depressed and even suicidal, and you helped me." And I just thought, you're doing that in your way, being a father figure to a generation that is seeking, and I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, well, there's a longing.
Yeah.
There's an innate longing for the realization of certain patterns, right? And the longing is vague. Yeah. It's deeply instantiated. The longing is vague, and there's various ways that it could be catalyzed.
Yeah.
But my sense as a developmental psychologist is that a neurologically intact child needs one good example, right? 0 is too few.
Yeah.
That's fatal, so to speak. But if you're neurologically intact, one example will do the trick.
Yeah.
And so you had the gentleman that you described. And, it's also for people who are more aesthetically oriented or intellectually oriented, they can often derive some of that from books and from abstracted representations. You can pull it in that way too, but you definitely need it.
So I think kind of the important takeaway, or the thing that I think is important to note, is that Jordan sort of framed this scenario with 3 different groups of young men. Kind of the cowardly ones that are going to be attracted to Christianity for the wrong reasons, because it's a safe choice. It gives them rules to follow, and they are doing it probably transactionally, believing that if they follow the rules, they will get a certain safe reward. On the other end of the spectrum are the troublemakers, those people who are destined for addiction and lives of crime and things like that. But then in the middle, is this much more broad range of young men who know how to take a risk, learn from their risk, incorporate what they learn as wisdom. But what I think is a serious problem is that middle section that was the majority of young men when Peterson was growing up has really eroded, and now that's probably the rarest category, and most guys are going to fall into the either and the or. Now, the safe guys are not necessarily going to cling to Christianity. They could cling to political ideology, maybe some on the right, some on the left, or it could just be, this not leaving your parents' basement thing, arrested development. But either way, it's a cowardice, and it's, really paralyzed by a lack of good examples. And then the other guys are going to go off the deep end. And part of the problem with that is that the addictions are so much more salient, due to the things on the internet and, chemical things too. Getting hooked on fentanyl is not the same as doing drugs it was in the 70s. And also there's a far less tolerance for those sort of behaviors. So when people start down a bad path, it could mean cancellation and your life is over, basically, career wise or potential wise, just because of the strict way that society has gone. So really the key thing that is needed is for men to be the kind of leader that Greg Laurie is being, and that he also sees that Jordan is being. And Greg also, he talked about how Chuck Smith was the guy who was a father figure to him and many other young men, and that he was a preacher, but in his time off, he was building stuff and doing normal things. And that's kind of the thing that is behind the project and the book that I've written. I only have the insanely large copy here, but smaller copy is available. But you know, like the way that a man communicates is not through his words, even though I'm speaking here on this camera. It's through the actions and the things that he does with his hands and the way he lives his life. So for me, my ideas would not mean anything if it weren't for the fact that at least some of my time, as much as I can, I try to bring young men into what I'm doing and share my time with them and show them how to do stuff. I do some of that at work, and I do some of that at church, and I try to do it with my kids too. That's a little different, but like it's not just the things that I have to say; it's what you do and the actions that you have. And the really amazing thing is what Jordan is saying is how many examples do men need? At least one. And that may be enough, and that's probably enough. But how many young men do not have one example of like a man showing them how to be a man? And it's super simple stuff. You take them to with you and go rake somebody's leaves, or show them how to fix stuff around your house, or whatever, or how to cook a meal, or basic things. And just really, it's the fact that men who take responsibility for life and for the problems that are around them and do something about fixing it are providing a powerful example that just needs to be seen by the young men that are around. And so that's really the key, the core principle behind the project that I am trying to start with Tectonic School. And the book that I wrote really just explores a lot of reasons why these sort of very basic things are, make the fabric of life. And they give you a lot of creative examples and ideas of ways you could kind of explore this stuff. So thank you for watching. Please check out the book. I'll put a link in the description. And I hope you enjoy this.